This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Now I started looking at the working class in Cuba in the 1950s, and of course that begged loads of questions about the 1940s, where I kind of went back to do some more research there. I've been looking in archives in Cuba as well as US archives online, I hasten to add, and there's quite a lot of interesting stuff at Kew as well. But really, I mean, it seemed to me that the Cold War started very early in Cuba. It was, I mean, if you think of like the sort of the things that really announced the Cold War, the Marshall Plan, Churchill's Iron Curtain speech, the founding of the CIA, this sort of thing, were all kind of early to mid 1947. By then, in Cuba, they were moving to purge the trade unions well before then, and so you know the standard historiography kind of gives us that in the late 40s in Cuba there was in the late 40s in Cuba, there was an attack and a purge on the of the trade unions that split them and finally drove the communists out of their leadership positions. And then it just sort of, most of them just add a little bit on the bottom. Oh, this was achieved by a mixture of government intervention and gangster violence. Then they kind of move on. But when I started looking at it, I found a dozen trade union leaders, including the General Secretary of the Sugar Workers Union, had been murdered. There was, and the level of gangsterism and the link between the government and these gangsters was actually quite extraordinary. And then, of course, I discovered that while the CIA hadn't really been formed yet, and so you know this sort of my Cuban friends are a bit disappointed that they can't blame the CIA for all of this. Nevertheless, of course, there is an American hand in it, in the form of the American Federation of Labour, who were also Cold Warriors before the declaration of the Cold War. In fact, they were probably anti-communist before there was even communists. And so on. So anyway, let's have a look at the background. In 1940, Batista, who went on later in the 50s to become the brutal dictator of Cuba, was actually elected in what was probably the first and only honest election in Cuba, and he was elected with the support of the Communist Party. In return for that support, they were allowed to set up the CTC, the Confederación de los Trabajadores de Cuba, the Union Federation, and Lázaro Peña, a tobacco worker, became General Secretary, and they kind of secured about a third of the executive for members of the Communist Party, and about another third for their allies. That when collectively they referred to themselves as unitarios, you know, those who are for unity. Which was quite a sort of common thing at the time. But anyway, we might go into that a bit later. But it was very much a state-sponsored union. It was, in terms of defending their members' interests, as it were, it mainly depended on the leadership's relationship with the Ministry of Labour. Local officials of the Ministry of Labour would frequently, during that Batista government, 1940 to 1944, would intervene on the side of the workers in terms of wage disputes and so on. And I mean, they did actually secure some very real improvements for Cuban workers. I mean, partly as a result of the 1940 Constitution, paid holidays, 44 hours work for 48 hours pay, The workers victimised in the 1935 general strike were reinstated. and pension funds were set up in the major industries. However, that was all done very much as kind of negotiations between union officials and the government, and which meant that in most industries there wasn't a great deal of mobilisation. I mean, the odd kind of half-hour protest strike to force a recalcitrant Ministry of Labour official to implement something, but it was all sort of very much on the kind of it was an incorporated union in that kind of sense. Now we have to look at this in the context of the Second World War and the Comintern policy of the Popular Front, and the Popular Front. Class collaboration is implicit in the concept of a popular front, but of course in Cuba they were very much influenced by the American Communist Party, led by one Earl Browder, which for a policy that became known as Browderism, and they took the Popular Front to an extreme conclusion, arguing that peaceful coexistence was possible between capital and labour as part of a wider peace between the USA and the USSR, which kind of went along, cut with the grain a bit during the Second World War, the war against fascism, and so on. Indeed, between 1938 and 1944, the Cuban Communist Party grew from 4,600 members to 65,000 members on this sort of. But it was again, it was very much this. But the Browderism was particularly implicit in this. June 1945, the war's obvious. The war's finishing. And Jacques Duclos, leading member of the French Communist Party, widely believed to be speaking on behalf of Stalin, but it doesn't matter whether he was or not. He said Ian believes he was quite distinctly. He wrote a letter criticising Browder because Browder had taken his own collaborationism to the extent of winding up the American Communist Party and renaming it the Communist Political Association or some such. William Z. Foster used this very much, who was an opponent of Browder's within the American Communist Party, to get rid of Browder and to reverse it back, so at least the Communist Party there existed. It's interesting that the Cuban Communist Party were a bit slow on the uptake of this, and I was looking at their paper, Oi, and it seems quite clear that they didn't renounce Browderism till January 1946, and William Z. Foster is billed as the star speaker at the Congress that finally admitted the errors. But I suspect he had to go there to whip them into line, if you see what I mean. But anyway, so this is the kind of the background and the context of it. If we go back to 1942, the CTC had voted to avoid strikes as far as possible for the duration of the war. This was, within the context of, Pearl Harbor, the German invasion of the Soviet Union. I mean, even Trujillo, the brutal dictator of the Dominican Republic, wasn't anti-fascist because he was on the. He was against the Germans, but the PSP, right? The Communist Party changed its name to the Partido Socialista Popular, the People's Socialist Party, whatever, and they got 2 ministers in the cabinet in return for their no strike deal, basically. And they worked for, as they put it, social peace and increased productivity. But Franklin Roosevelt was not happy with this. It's one thing having your communists working for peace and productivity, but having two communists in the cabinet was a step too far, and which meant that he never trusted Batista, and so in 1944, when Batista was coming up for re-election, the Office of Naval Intelligence sent Majelansky, the mafia gangster, and a personal friend of Batista, to Cuba to tell him that Roosevelt says don't stand again. This close relationship between the US intelligence community and the mafia shouldn't surprise us. I mean, they used Lucky Luciano to help with the invasion of Sicily, and so on. Anyway, so the 1940 Batista didn't stand again, and the 1944 elections were won by one Ramon Grau San Martin, an anti-communist, but a completely unprincipled, completely corrupt anti-communist, and although one suspects he would have been anti whatever Roosevelt told him to be against, but that's neither here nor there. But he didn't have a majority in Parliament, so he needed communist votes. So what he started to do was prepare the ground for dealing with the Communist Party in the Union Federation, and it's this period from 1944 onwards that we start to see the growth of armed gangs in Cuba. Very quite violent, mainly directed against each other, but there were and all giving themselves names like the Revolutionary Socialists and things like this, but very, very closely linked to Grau San Martin, and he encouraged the setting up of supporters of his own party, the Auténticos, the authentic revolutionaries, within the federation, and they set up something called the Comisión Obrera Nacional Auténtica, the National Workers' Commission, or the CON, which became known as La Con, the Con, and they then started to prepare the ground for the takeover. So I said earlier that there was a US dimension to this. The 1943, the American Federation of Labour invited Juan Aravelo, one of the leaders of the Dockers Union, over to Washington, of the Cuban Dockers Union, that is, I hasten to add, where he met this lovely character, Serafino Romaldi. Serafino Romaldi was an anti-communist Italian social democrat who'd fled the USA on the rise to get away from Mussolini. Then he worked for the OSS, the forerunner of the CIA, first of all in Italy, where Lucky Luciano was also, etc., and so on. But his main idea was to build a moderate labour resistance that was opposed to the mainstream communist-led partisans. He sometime in 1943-1944 he transferred to the Office of Inter-American Affairs, run by Rockefeller, which was a part of the American state machine, really, and was given a job with the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, and started touring in Latin America. Philip Agee describes him as being the principal CIA agent for labour operations in Latin America. And his principal task at the time was to destroy the Confederación de Trabajadores de América Latina, the CTAL, which was a confederation, an international confederation that covered, at the time, pretty well all of the labour confederations in Latin America. But it was headed by a Mexican called Vicente Lombardo Toledano, who was who was seen as a fellow traveller of the Communist Party, and therefore this was seen as part of the the AFL, seeing the Cold War coming, started to move against Setal fairly early on. Romaldi saw the Cuban CTC as being one of the principal battlegrounds, or an area where he could work quite well. So Juan Arevalo was the Secretary of Foreign Relations of the CTC. So he was and it's interesting, if you go through the US diplomatic archives from the period, there are continual references to, I had lunch today with Juan Arevalo, Juan Arevalo dropped into the embassy today, and so on. And he was using this he was using the US embassy as a postbox, really, for his connection with the American Federation of Labour, as a postbox. Anyway, so September 1945, Arevalo, accompanied by one Francisco Aguirre. Francisco Aguirre was one of the leaders of the Restaurant Workers Union. Given the size of the tourist industry in Cuba, of course, they were very, quite so significant, particularly in Havana with the big hotels and so on. And a chap called Eusebio Mujal, who has never been a worker but managed to seem to get positions in unions by. I mean, I know a lot of bureaucrats are like that, as it were. Present company accepted, but
thank you.
But he was, he was very much just a politician who worked within that kind of field. So the three of them in September 45 went and had a meeting with Sidney Green, a president of the American Federation of Labour, various State Department officials, and agreed that they would set up a new international confederation that would exclude the communists. So they wanted to split CETAL and set up a new international federation. In January 1946, Sidney Green proposed that anti-communist trade unionists made a tour of Latin America, and Arevalo and Francisco Aguirre went to a specially convened meeting of the executive of the American Federation of Labour in Miami to discuss this. Unfortunately for them, this was reported in the Miami local papers, and when they got back, they were faced with a disciplinary inquiry. But their explanations were accepted in the name of unity. I can't imagine they were probably believed, but they were so. Anyway, despite these promises, and they promised never to have anything more to do with the American Federation of Labour or shocking, etc. Despite this, Arevalo maintained his links with the State Department. And again, he keeps cropping up in the State Department archives. Unfortunately, because the American Federation of Labour is not a public body, we can't do a freedom of information on them. There's a campaign by the San Francisco Bay Area Federation of Labour to open their historical records, but it's been going for quite some time without any great success. Right, Grau, the president, plays his cards very close to his chest. He's assuring the British and the Americans what an anti-communist he is. But for instance, when William Z. Foster went over to speak at the CTC Congress, Grau invites him to a lunch at the presidential palace and so on. So he's playing both ends against the middle, but he still needs the communist votes up until the mid-term parliamentary elections in 1946, when he wins a majority in the House of Representatives. No longer needs the votes of the communist deputies, and makes this speech where he calls upon Cubans to abandon foreign doctrines. This, of course, is basically a sign to the con that he's let him off the lead. The PSP, however, doesn't finally withdraw support from the government until April 1947. The 5th Congress of the CTC was planned for April 1947, but on the 3rd, for the 6th of April, on the 3rd of April, a group of gangsters machine gun the PSP offices in Havana. Nobody's hurt, but on the 5th there are more shooting attacks on neighbourhood Communist Party offices, and 3 people were wounded. Francisco Aguirre, who's managed to get himself as chair of the Credentials Commission, refused to recognise the credentials of a number of delegates who were known to support the PSP. And here we get another character, Emilio Suri Castillo, who was a secretary of the CON and a leading member of the Sugar Workers Federation, led a march on the offices of the on the local offices of the Textile Workers Union, where the credentials were actually kept, with the intention of taking them. The people in the building fight back, and in the process, one of the right-wing members of the CON, Felix Pillo, gets thrown off a balcony and dies. The Minister of Labour, who's one Carlos Prio, uses this as an excuse to suspend the Congress and appoint a new Credentials Commission. Now, I think now we come to see that these dangers of the state-sponsored nature of the union meant that if the Ministry of Labour says it's not happening, it doesn't happen. Which, I mean, seems shocking enough in itself, and so on. Then on the 6th, the police raid the offices of the CTC and arrest several people, including the Havana Dockers leader, Araceli Iglesias, of whom are more later, and accusing them of possession of arms. Now, as the British ambassador at the time said, no one in Cuba at this time was less likely to be in possession of firearms than the Communist Party. But of course, well, we see it today, don't we? Coppers turn up. Oh, look, there's a gun there. It's not it's nothing new. This is really just kind of intimidation, as it were. Lázaro Peña decides not to wait. Lázaro Peña, that's the Communist General Secretary of the CTC, decides not to wait for the credentials report and convenes the 5th Congress on the 4th of May, having had a remarkably successful May Day march where something like 200,000 people turned up. The CON and a group of independent members of the executive, mainly ex-communists who saw the way the wind was blowing and wanted to get themselves into a better position, they boycott the meeting. But of course, President Grau sends a message of congratulations on what I hope you have a good conference, and so on. About 3/4 of union branches were represented, so that's and 923 local unions, and so on. And only about 300 boycott it. And this was considered a great success, and everyone within the CTC on the left thought that they'd dealt with this matter and that they'd resolved. But Carlos Prio was working behind the scenes, and the independents and the CON people organised their own congress in a cinema in Vedado. And they elect an independent ex-communist, the leader of the Electrical Workers Union, Angel Corfino, as General Secretary. They declare that they are the CTC, and of course Carlos Prio then, in October, says they're the CTC, and that the Lázaro Peña majority are not the CTC anymore. And because the state has built a marvellous building for the CTC, the Palacio de los Trabajadores, the Workers' Palace, the police then kick the Lázaro Peña and his colleagues out of there and give it to their new favourites. It transpired that the Ministry of Education had financed this other Congress with $40,000 from a fund that was intended to pay for primary education. Anyway, so as they expelled them from the Palacio de los Trabajadores, there were protest strikes all over the country, of about often 5 or 10 minutes. And I think what we see here is the habit of protesting, the habit of protest strikes. I mean, it dies very hard. And so Lázaro Peña writes to the president, who, shocking, and that's but of course they're still kicked out, and so on. So on the 29th of July, the Unitarios are expelled from the CTC headquarters. On the 31st of July, Francisco Aguirre and Eusebio Mojal are straight off to Washington on a special delegation financed by the government, where they meet Serafina Romaldi again and the Assistant Secretary of State for Inter-American Affairs. So we start to see the AFL sort of, I think, their fingerprints are all over this. On the 9th of October, they're finally, the Ministry of Labour declares formally that Ángel Caffiño is the General Secretary of the CTC, and Lázaro Peña called for a 4-hour protest strike. Yep. Of course, what happens is the police then arrest people when they go back to work after the fight. Hundreds of people are arrested, and so on. And this kind of breaks it. They then move against the communists, the Unitarios, in the constituent federations, and the same thing happens. Police raids, right-wing leaders installed in the in a whole number of constituent federations. Now that works in about half of the areas, but so there were some areas within the community who had been a lot more combative, who had not been quite so reliant upon the Ministry of Labour, and it took a bit more there. So if we have a quick look at public transport, for instance, on the 27th of October, there's a peaceful demonstration against an attempt by the police to take over the Transport Workers Union outside the Ministry of Labour. Then a group of them go down to the offices of the Communist Party newspaper Oi to request that our voice be placed on the front page. I mean, it's a fairly standard sort of tactic of, and then they can be photographed appealing. I'm sure we've all done things like this, haven't we? Except for this time, one Comandante Azuki opens fire on them with no warning. 3 bus workers are wounded, one of whom dies on the 12th of November. Then on the 29th of October, the police move in and eject the remaining communists from the office of the Sindicato de Motoristas, the bus drivers' local office, and then on the 10th of November, there's this one Manuel Montero, who's quite a leading communist activist, is sat in a cafe drinking with his friends when some gunmen from something called Acción Revolucionaria Guiteras, which was a gang of gangsters, drive past shooting dead. This ARG, very close links with Carlos Prio. The 3rd of December, 3 tram drivers are also chatting at a terminus, and these aren't even particularly important trade unionists. They're just known to be loyal to the old leadership. They get wounded, and then on the 11th of April, Hector Cabrero again killed at a terminus. The ARG that were doing this were led by one Marco Irigoyen, and he used this. He was a bus driver. He used this wave of assassinations to take over the union, and the tramway company gave him 200 jobs to employ members of his gang so that they could keep the rest of the bus drivers intimidated. Unfortunately for them, of course, there were 2 factions within this ARG who quarrelled because they then started selling the jobs to And there were two factions who fell out over the rake-off from this, and they ended up in a gunfight amongst themselves. They had to be separated by the police. So anyway, Marco Irigoyen quickly rose to become the general secretary of the Transport Workers Union, the Transport Workers Federation, and got a place on the CTC executive for his pains. But still had to maintain a certain level of popular support. But they did this from a very kind of reactionary, populist position. So, for instance, they announced themselves very much in favour of a fare increase to ensure the company could afford existing starting wage levels. Those minority of transport workers who took a more principled position on this were violent intimidation. And this is the one, as an ex-bus driver, this is the one that gets me. On the 20th of October 1948, Carlos Febles, who'd been active in the campaign against the fare rise, is sleeping on the back of his bus at the terminus. Finding me a bus driver who has not slept on the back of his bus at the terminus, and a gangster gets on and blows his brains out. Anyway, that was how the takeover occurred in the Transport Workers Union. Francisco Aguirre was rewarded for what he'd done by being made Minister of Labour. And when Carlos Prio, the previous Minister of Labour, had to resign so that he could stand for President, on the 31st of January 1948, Aguirre annulled the elections in the Tobacco Workers Union. But they were engaged at that time in a campaign against mechanisation of cigar rolling and basically completely ignored this ruling. Aguirre appointed one Manuel Campanaria as the new head of the Tobacco Workers Federation, and on the 1st of April he attacked. They organised an attack on the offices of the Sindicato de Tosadores, the tobacco rollers local in Havana, which is now the Labour Museum in Havana, and it's a lovely building. And you can see from there, it's actually quite easy to defend. So then the police never got in. They barred the doors from the inside and threw things off the balcony onto their heads. Not content with this, the next day Campanaria and 10 others himself went into the Corona, the famous Corona cigar factory, and shot Miguel Fernandez, who was the union representative in the workshop, and then escaped in police cars. But they held elections again in 1948, and 88% voted for a communist called Evelio Lugo. And this is something that keeps happening every time a halfway democratic election's held. The old leaders get re-elected. So that means that, of course, elections don't get held because the Ministry of Labour decides when elections should be held and controls them. The government didn't like this. This time they seized the building in the early hours of the morning, and the tobacco workers responded with a general strike. 900 pickets were arrested, and they stayed out until all of the people were released. Interesting, very large number of women cigar leaf strippers, the despiadoras, who were, and there's some amazing pictures in the newspapers of hundreds of these women in prison shaking the barriers and kind of generally into so. And in fact, I think this is one where this campaign of violence was only partially successful. People were appointed to be the new leadership, and the tobacco workers took no notice and carried on organising themselves, and so on. The sugar industry was obviously the one that was of central importance, and this chap Suri Castillo, who I mentioned earlier, had taken over the official structure, but Jesus Menendez, who was the general secretary, a remarkably popular man by all accounts, came from a very poor black family in the country, and was obviously quite a charismatic leader. I mean, I've seen bits of video of him speaking, and you feel yourself kind of going like this every time he speaks. You know what I mean? And so on. They couldn't break that popularity that he had. Part of which was based, of course, on the fact that in 1946 he got himself included in the sugar harvest negotiations with the United States Secretary of Agriculture, and managed to get a guarantee clause, which was an agreement which linked the price paid for sugar to the inflation in goods imported from the United States. And he then managed to get that of the $36 million that was saved by this negotiation. He managed to get $25 million paid as a bonus to the sugar workers, so there was some basis for his popularity. But after the takeover of the CTC, the government then abrogated that agreement, and so in January '48, Menendez, still calling himself General Secretary of the Sugar Workers Union, touring the island, organising a strike to demand the return of the guarantee clause. On January the 10th, he's on a train to Matanzas in western Cuba. An army officer tells him that he's under arrest. He says that he's a parliamentary deputy and therefore immune, and makes a few vulgar remarks and walks away. As he gets off the train, the policeman says, "You're under arrest," and he kind of goes, and so the copper blows his brains out. I think here we have now again massive protest strikes all over Cuba. 150,000 people attended his funeral, but without his lead, that strike then never happened. And I think and again, we see a decline again in the Sugar Workers Union up until, so they're not really active again until 1955 when they did have another massive strike. Finally, let's have a quick look at the docs. Then I'll and I mentioned Araceli Iglesias. Now, Araceli Iglesias was the Bob Crow of his day. He was the man the Cuban bourgeoisie loved to hate. A man called Bradley, who ran the American Ship Owners Federation, called him the Red Tsar of the port of Havana. The American, the US archives are full of complaints from ship owners to say that that man Iglesias turned up in my office and said that they wouldn't unload my ship unless we paid an extra bonus, or told me that the agreement said that we had to employ 12 labourers when only 3 are needed, and so on. So there's this constant. The news magazine Bohemia did an attack on him, calling Havana the most expensive port in the world, but of course on this they do an interview with him, and there's a picture of him surrounded by all these other dockers with a big grin on his face, because yes, it is, and so on. And he and they had very much they had the Havana dockers. I think what is interesting about them, Havana dockers, very largely Afro-Cuban, very large numbers of them members of secret societies, sort of religious Santeria groups, in Regla in particular. Araceli Iglesias was, he was a member of the Communist Party, but he was also a Santeria adept as well. I mean, he and they very much relied upon their own muscle, and of course, immense power. The longer something is not unloaded, the ship is not making any money, and they were and so on, and so he was re-elected again as secretary for the port of Havana after he was removed from office by an official for an official election. He called a mass meeting. The mass meeting stuck their hands up to vote for him, and so he carried on. And I think this is the government annulled the elections, and he just didn't care. So they occupied the union office. The port went out on strike until the employers asked the government to remove these the people that they'd imposed as leaders. On the 15th of October 1948, he organised a mass meeting that voted to refuse to pay their union subscriptions anymore. And 2 days later, he's sat in the union office. 2 gunmen come in and shoot him in the back. And again, escape in police cars. It's interesting. We know who these people are. I've got pictures of them. They were arrested very much always for their own protection. They'd spend a couple of days in prison, and then they would disappear. So there were strikes again all over the country. His funeral was a massive protest, but what happened here, I think, is actually the strikes continue in the docks. The extortion of the employers continues in the docks. We never discover the name of another leader of the Havana dockers. They then operate completely underground from 1948 right through to 1959. When incidentally, 1958, when the British supplied aircraft to Batista to use against the rebels in the hills, the famous Sea Furies. British love to give second-hand aeroplanes to people, don't they? And the Havana dockers refused to unload them. So when the rebels arrived in Havana, the packing cases were still sat there waiting for them. And interestingly enough, just as a little anecdote, those Sea Furies were first used against the Bay of Pigs invasion. And I think that they managed to prevent bulk loading of sugar through to 1959. They managed to prevent the sea train ferry, which would have been a kind of roll-on, roll-off ferry, which would have done. They never refused to operate these things. They just say we want to employ the same number of people, which of course obviously wasn't what the employers had in mind. So they did manage to maintain their organisation, and I do think that these little Afro-Cuban semi-religious secret societies did actually prepare the ground for sort of prepare people for doing this. So basically, this did get the CTC was taken over. Grau and Prio are again, their fingerprints are all over this. They were Prio became president after Grau from 1944 to 1948. I would argue they raised what was known as gangsterismo to a sort of level of government of a method of government. Prio, when he was elected, he appointed 2,000 known gangsters to the civil service payroll. Then, when he became increasingly unpopular after sort of about 46, 47, it became the habit in the newsreels in cinemas for people to whistle whenever he came on the newsreel. His gangsters would sit in the back row with blackjacks and whack people who whistled. And so on. And the police and the gangsters were working very closely together, to the extent that in 1947 there was a gunfight between 2 factions of police. One was run by the head of the police academy, and the other was run by the head of special investigations. Both of them linked with 2 separate gangs who were fighting for sort of control of the Waco. After 6 people had died, the army separated them. the British government, the British embassy, calculates that while Priaulx was president, he embezzled 90 million pesos, $90 million. A peso was equivalent to a dollar. That's in the money of the time. Whereas Grau was actually accused in the courts in Cuba of embezzling 175 million pesos. But it never came to court because all the papers were kept in a court where some gangsters walked in one day, held the court up and took all the papers, and so on. And of course they were linked to the US mafia as well, although there's a bloke called Jack Calhoun who's written a wonderful book on this. And he argues that the difference between Grau and Priaulx was that Grau was involved with drug trafficking and a friend of Santo Trafficante, whereas Priaulx was more interested in gambling and was a friend of Meyer Lansky and Lucky Luciano. When the FBI finally put enough pressure on Priaulx to deport Lucky Luciano, who was living in the Hotel Nacional at the time, Priaulx's brother, who was also mayor of Havana, drove him to the ship. So there you go. To get back, just to finish off, just to get back to the American Federation of Labour, they were then able to use their control of the CTC as a Trojan horse to split the CETAL, the Federation for the whole of Latin America. And they set up a rival called the CIT, which was founded in Lima, but was basically run by the CTC, and Francisco Aguirre again becomes the secretary of it. The president of it, while Serafino Romaldi becomes the secretary. This became the more famous ORIT, which the Organización Regional Interamericana de los Trabajadores, the Inter-American Regional Organisation of Labour. But Aguirre was actually too corrupt, incompetent and lazy even for the American Federation of Labour, and was finally forced out in 1952. Aravello, I would say, was probably the only honest one amongst them. I think he was actually a genuine right-wing social democrat. So he was murdered in September 1948, probably on the orders of Suri Castillo. I say this because I'm just going to finish on this point. I've got this off the. This is from the microfilm US Diplomatic Archives. And the ambassador writes back to Washington. Senor Emilio Suri Castillo, Cuban congressman and head of the National Federation of Sugar Workers, called on me this morning, accompanied by his secretary, in inverted commas, Tomas de la Cruz, and Julio Oropeza, who runs horses. I was informed that Policarpo Soler, who reportedly escaped from prison recently and whose whereabouts is at present unknown to the public, was in fact rescued from jail by Suri Castillo's men. It will be recalled that Soler is the man who killed Araceli Iglesias, the leader of the port workers and a communist. I was told today that Soler had deliberately killed Iglesias at the instance of the Suri Castillo faction, and that the purpose of the killing was to reduce communist control of the port workers. According to De La Cruz, the communists are still powerful amongst the port workers, and it will be necessary to eliminate 2 or 3 more. So just the final kind of reflection on this struck me that my first reaction is how pissed we are these people. They start shooting at leaders down, and they have a 4-hour general strike. And then I sort of thought, well, if someone shot Len McCluskey tomorrow, we'd be lucky to have a 4-hour general strike.
Depends who it was that's doing the shooting.
Well, precisely. But but I do think that it is a warning. There's a warning here to those who think that workers' parties can become involved in bourgeois governments.
Thank you. We've got some time now for questions or comment or criticism. Floor's open. Yes.
Okay, just a quick one about the setting. You opened by saying that Cuba marks the opening of the Cold War. The sort of early shots are earlier than they are in most other places. They're earlier and they're obviously much more brutal than they are in other places. Why do you think, in the global context, then, that everyone is so poised to attack the Communist Party?
I think they were. People were getting ready all over Latin America. There were, but I think that Cuba had the highest percentage of unionized workers in Latin America. It had the biggest communist party in Latin America, and of course with its traditional neo-colonial status, where it's kind of, I know this term neo-colonial is thrown about a bit willy-nilly, but I think it's actually quite appropriate to use it about the nature of Cuba's relationship with the United States. And the American Federation of Labour had been therefore had probably closer links as a result of that kind of relationship. And it was other countries in Latin America had much more divided federations. There were often two. Cuba had one, and I think it was very much seen that if they could crack that, then they had the Trojan horse to get in to the rest of the rest of it. And then of course you had these. But of course, and probably they recognised the vulnerability of a trade union that is very much dependent upon its relationship with the state, and of course those benefits that had been got from that. I mean, getting 44 hours work for 48 hours pay, ain't bad. The 1940 Constitution recognised as one of the most progressive in anywhere. I mean, it was aspirational rather than, but of course in the rest of Latin America there wasn't even the aspiration. So I think there was, and the example, if you could have smashed that, well then you're going to give heart to right wingers like Ibanez in Chile, like the Apristas in Peru, and so on. Those sort of. Often quite opportunist. The British Embassy is absolutely scathing about these people, saying, they call themselves anti-communist, but that's only because that seems to be the way to get money off the Americans, and things like this, and they're very much, they want it for themselves,
Yes.
What happens next? Do the union...
You've done that before.
I like stories. Do the unions stay clearly dominated by the right, the thugs?
Yes.
Till 59?
Till 59. Yes, by and large. This chap, Eusebio Mujal, is the one who then takes over, becomes the General Secretary. And he runs it, sets up an absolutely corrupt bureaucracy. He was paid $250,000 a year in 1951. It's not bad money today. That's, so we're talking that's 10, 15 times that he became. And once, because 1952 we have the Batista's coup, and Mujal moves the CTC bureaucracy into being one of the major supports of the dictatorship. Although, just if if you like a little story, when Batista fled on New Year's Day 1959, he didn't tell Mughal that he was going. And the rebels arrived in Havana looking for him, and he had to flee into the Argentine embassy. But he still had his money out.
Yes.
Do you think, I'm just listening to your story, in a sense, it was so blatant, so obvious now. Do you think the Cuban revolution was made even more inevitable because of the policy of the AFL and obviously the US government's tactics there? Perhaps if they'd been a little bit more covert. I mean, there was an arrogance there, wasn't there? We were sending the mafia and they can kill them, and you know, in a sense, they weren't very. It doesn't strike me as very clever as a colonial power and whatever else. And perhaps if they'd been a little bit more like the British had in other colonies or whatever, they may not
might have hung on to
that
it. Yes, and I think they started to realise that themselves because when it came to 1954 and Guatemala, they didn't rely on amateurs like the mafia and the AFL. The CIA did it themselves in-house. They didn't outsource it to others. They used the AFL to weaken and split the Guatemalan Trade Union Federation, but then they made sure that they organised the Operation PB Success. And it's interesting that, to me, that the man who planned that, William Pauly, was actually running the Havana Bus Company in 1950 at the time when Marco Irigoyen was killing his... so he actually saw... But of course, he then fell out with Marco Irigoyen because Irigoyen started... and I think the other thing that particularly the Cuban bourgeoisie found was that the communists had been honest. These Mujalistas, as they became known, not only wanted pay rises because they required a certain amount of popular support, but they wanted a rake off as well. So it was, you're right. It was a complete muck up, but the CIA learnt from it.
Other points? We've still got ample time.
I suppose I'd like to pick up your question about the defeat of trade union activists, because in fact, in talking to you earlier, there's actually quite a lot of covert union activity in the 50s in the build-up. I mean, isn't there your main thesis that this isn't just a handful of rebels in the hills, this is actually an organised movement. So how they organised? You suggested that the dock workers could fall back on links of solidarity that involved Santa Maria and other clandestine organisations. How do the other unions work, and did the tobacco workers, for example, manage to maintain the independence that they...
The tobacco workers, using the fact that they were quite skilled and hard to replace, and had that kind of slightly arrogant skilled worker solidarity, were able to maintain an organisation. And of course, you're not talking about many, but you're talking about quite... So they managed to maintain their structures, such that even in 1956, they were still having to expel people from the union. To whenever there was a halfway honest election, the old people would get back, and they would strike to maintain union leaders. So that was the tobacco workers managed it. The sugar workers in Cuba are very much like miners in Europe. The communities that are based where everyone's a sugar worker, where the people who run the little shops depend upon are normally ex-sugar workers. They rely on that community, that great community solidarity. And because the sugar harvest is only at most 5 months of the year, and the rest of the time they go off and become building workers, but do little pots, go hungry, you know what I mean. There's it's very hard to build a bureaucracy there. Now, I think that's why, for instance, Jesus Menendez relied very much upon this charisma, because it was very hard to build those structures. But of course, that, in one sense, that did mean that it was quite easy to regenerate the struggle as well. Then, of course, you've got this all very much happened in Havana. In the east of the island, in Guantanamo, you had Guantanamo. You had a group of half the Trotskyists in Cuba were in Guantanamo, the Partido Bolshevista Leninista, and some remarkable organisers there who, and they. Guantanamo is so far to the east. In those days, the only way to get there was by train. So the train drivers were remarkably powerful, and so they maintained their organisation. So there were these sorts of specific structural things that enabled some of the ones to some of these things to continue. And of course, the new right-wing leadership, while they were had to maintain a certain level of popular support. So the British Embassy reports are just full of Mujhal's extortionate attitude. There's about how idle the Cuban workers are. That they expect 20 men expect to unload a ship that will only take 3. This sort of thing. So there was it kind of, and I mean, one thing I would argue, that was why why the Cuban bourgeoisie supported Batista's coup, was because this hadn't worked. This hadn't increased productivity. It had just added a layer of corruption onto a pretty unproductive workforce anyway, which wasn't quite what they had in mind when they started. And the American Federation of Labour was much more interested in just smashing the communists and then moving on. You're looking concerned, Ian.
Yeah. And you told this story at the beginning about Browderism.
Yeah.
What I'd be interested to know is what exactly do we know even, the relationship between the Cuban communists and Moscow? I mean, one tends to have this image that Moscow controls everything, Joe snaps his finger and everybody all over the world jumps. In fact, if you look at Browderism, it's quite interesting. You have this deviation in America. You actually have to get somebody in France to sort out the Americans, and then the Americans have to sort out the Cubans.
Yeah.
I wondered to what extent the Cuban Communist Party was under any direct influence from Moscow. Do we know how effective their apparatus was in this sort of fashion?
The Comintern man in Cuba was Fabio Grobert, who was a Pole, who naturalised as a Cuban, but he went native, and he became more of a Cuban communist than a Comintern man, and in fact was finally deported by Batista in the mid-50s, but was straight back there in 1959. I mean, he was on the first plane back, and he stayed there till he died. So I think that's always a danger when you send someone somewhere to organise something, and then as the British colonials discover, they kind of go native, as it were. So there wasn't that particularly direct link. It was the US Communist Party. The Comintern gave the US Communist Party responsibility for Cuba, rather in the way that the British Communist Party was given responsibility for the British colonies, and so on.
And the French were given responsibility for the British.
Yes. Yes. That must have rankled. And so on. So but I think and it is a bit more complicated, because William Z. Foster had opposed Browder vitriolically. They hated one another, and William Z. he was a Stalinist Stalin is pura idiota. But I mean, he was an ex-steel worker. He had some idea of what was needed. You know, I mean, he was, people say, a very good trade union organiser from the days, you know, when he was, you know, the Trade Union Education League, and so on. And he still had quite a following in the CPUSA, which meant that when Duclos, as it were, gave the light, this is okay now, and I think everyone had. I mean, it is remarkable the way the Second World War seemed to get people to lose any sense of critical thought. Sort of, and that it's a war against fascism, so we have to put up with almost anything. And it was, but I think certainly both the US ruling class and the Cuban bourgeoisie. Robin Blackburn argues that the Cuban bourgeoisie was actually just a subset of the American bourgeoisie, as it were. They had taken the mickey horribly during the war. They had profiteered, they had speculated, they had run roughshod over agreements, they'd taken absolute full advantage of the no strike deals, and a lot of people were very fed up with this. So there's pressure from below. Browder's presumably having trouble keeping people in order, and then someone of the stature of Duclos, who, of course, the Fosterites would be going around saying, "It's what Uncle Joe's saying. You know, that's what it means. That's what it means. We can do it." That would have pushed for a. That would have then pushed, given them the impetus they needed to get rid of Browder, who, of course, was remarkably arrogant. Personally as well, you know, so I mean, he made an awful lot of enemies. In Cuba, the same pressure was happening. So, for instance, in 1944, now we're still talking. No, this is D-Day has just happened, and there's a massive textile workers' strike in Havana with the support of the Communist Party, and it doesn't last very long. But the textile employers have been taking the mickey so much. So there was this kind of, the pressure's building up from below as well, and I think it's a bit like when, you know, the sudden change of line over when they after Barbarossa, and they got rid of the Hitler-Stalin Pact. So many communists must have gone, thank God for that, you know. And I suspect that when the word came that we don't need to be Browderist anymore, a lot of people must have gone, oh, at last, thank God. So, you know, I mean, that's why I agree with you. It's a much more complicated, than sort of approach. Yes.
I have learned a lot here today from my own context because I'm interested to know your ideas of why in this period, the 40s. Besides the killing of these unionist leaders, nothing else happened. I mean, no.
I think.
It didn't lead to anything like it happened with Batista and Fidel and these people. So it was like killing those people, massive strikes.
But I think, okay, well, what else? I mean, it is interesting. I mean, I think, okay, with the benefit of hindsight, it would seem to me that they should have built a militia that would defend their leaders. They should have issued pistols to their leaders. But I just sort of my slightly joking remark about if they killed Len McCluskey. I mean, would we have, would I give a Colt 45 to Sally Hunt and say, look after yourself, babe, you need this? I suspect, because they had been in the government, they had got what they wanted by protesting. Just fairly mild protests, and suddenly, with hindsight, we can see the pattern. But I think there's a danger in hindsight. What I think it does mean, what we have to say is, should this ever happen again? Well, we know what's coming, and I think that's the truth. But having spent the whole war, basically with ministers in the government, your deputies are voting for, for government policies and so on, which is again I said, about workers' parties in bourgeois governments is, then suddenly they move against you, but they don't move openly, and they can say, "What's these criminals? Dreadful, the state of anarchy in the streets." The facts that some people are saying, but these gangsters are linked to the government. Oh no, you know what I mean? So it was actually. I can say these things because I know them now, but at the time I'm not sure I would have been able to say it. If you see what I mean, and I think that this is, and then the other thing is, of course, with the trade union bureaucracy. Again, no disrespect to those present. They are they're slow moving. They're slow moving. They're used to doing things officially. You have what's on the agenda, brothers, today? Killing of trade union. No, that's not been put on the agenda. It's sort of. And you can see how this slows everything down, this dead hand. I mean, as you and I were sort of speaking of earlier. Yeah. This kind of, and I think so you then protest to the president. The president listens to your protest. Oh, he goes, say, "I'll do something about this," and what he's actually thinking is, "Yeah, you're next." But it's so. I think that's. And it's not it's a sort of, yeah.
I mean, I'm not sure you can make comparisons with Sally Hunt and the rest of them. I mean, probably somebody who assassinated Scargill at the time or whatever, who might have had people out on the streets. But also the situation was very, very different, wasn't it? I mean, these were people, from what you're telling us, these were people who were organising, were in some sort of solidarity, who'd been, were in communities that fought back and everything else and that.
But
and I know the bureaucracy to some extent can take hold, but perhaps it's unfair of us to say.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, that's what I.
To some extent, that's like, well, what the rest doing?
That's what I mean. That's what I.
Jump as well to deny.
Yeah.
And to have a revolution. You know what I mean?
Well, I think that
for all whatever we want to think about that.
There was a process that people, and of course, what happened was people then started to organise underground, and it takes the time to build things up again. It takes, sort of, you need to, it's much harder, you need to build up networks, and once people, if you've got, now like in the situation I was talking about in the buses, when you've got 200 gangsters employed as bus drivers, and you don't even sleep at the terminus anymore, it's very hard to know who do I trust. So you start to, so you start by leaving leaflets about on bus seats, in the canteen, and that does take a bit of time. Yes, I mean, like you, I mean, I was weak bastards. Why didn't they do something? But I do think we knew, that's with hindsight.
You make comparisons with the South African situation, where obviously they were under similar sort of pressing. They did take the struggles back to the communities and were able to. I
think the difference is in South Africa. I mean, it was just a straight plain dictatorship, wasn't it? I mean, the apartheid regime, and they didn't use.
I was thinking the fear.
They didn't use.
It makes it very, very difficult.
They didn't. It does. Yeah.
I'm just thinking of the different tactics, different labour movements have taken on.
Toby, did you want to say something?
Yeah, it occurred to me as just now really, that Italy in the late 40s, that in Sicily where they're shooting communists and trade unionists, there's a similar sort of reaction, and the mafia and various bandits are involved in it, a similar reaction to what you're saying in Cuba, and that they don't fight back. Yet in terms of northern Italy, when the assassination attempt on Togliatti in July 48, there's sort of massive general strike for days, and the party has to really restrain a lot of the base in a number of areas, particularly Genoa and around Siena and various other places. But in Sicily, the fear thing, the mafia, is operative, and that sort of smashes peasant movements.
Again, my knowledge of that time, basically what I learned in school, is a corruption of Bravo and Prio. So the main thing. So, but they do mention in the official history books the union leaders, Lázaro Peña, Jesus Menendez, Araceli Iglesias. This was a mention of the. We see the same speech. I think it's the only one that you see in the of Menendez, and that's all. So these were the union leaders. They were very good. Now they mention that Araceli Iglesias also was a member of. Actually, it's not Santeria. It's another thing.
Yes. There were various. I mean, levels of Afro-Cuban sort of societies.
It's another sect.
Yeah.
What's the name now? It's very difficult to get in. So you can belong if you're white man as well, but it's very difficult if you're white to enter into that. It's not that easy. So Amaqua is the name.
Yeah.
Secret society. That is still secret. So
that's So. Shh.
But what the book says is just that. Is that these governments were really corrupt. My grandfather was a very strong follower of the Identical, so that's what I was asking when you mentioned. My grandfather was a very fan of Prio. Was like Prio was the right president.
Yes.
So still, he died saying that Prio was the right president of the country.
Well,
some weird news.
I'd look under the floorboards then. There might be some money.
So, but apart from that official, the other side is very dark for us and the young Cubans.
Well, it's such
and what we have been looking at, and now there are very few historians that actually dig in that part of the history of Cuba. It's not that, and it's like there is a dark side of this Lázaro Peña and Iglesias. So Lázaro Peña was actually stealing money from the Young Union and having orgies and things like that. There's a dark side of the story that somehow somebody knew at the time as well. So it's not like the only person I do know that it was very really respected and still is Menendez. So Menendez was very and it was. I mean, I know personally because my great grandfather met him, and he was like, "That's a very great person," and it was like. And the common people, and that's what. That's a very good leader. We are very thinking.
There are old people today in Cuba that I've met, who one of the first things they will tell you, if you want to interview them, one of the first things they'll say is, "I once met Jesus Menendez," and they're sort of. It's a sort of, I mean, he's got a legendary sort of reputation, which of course then builds up on itself. So they probably didn't even meet him, if you see what I mean. But it's kind of, I think he was probably, but that goes back to the nature of the sugar industry as well. That because it was very hard to organise in a kind of bureaucratic trade union. Then someone comes along who just sort of personifies it. You can see how that kind of works. And so then when he's taken out, that did matter. I mean, it was a loss for them when they shot Araceli Iglesias, but there were some other people who knew exactly what to do, if you see what I mean. Whereas I don't think there was in this case.
Menendez was killed by the police, I think.
Who?
Menendez was killed by the police.
Yeah, by a policeman, yes.
My grandfather. My grandfather was the head of the police.
Ah.
And he got the order. So
Yeah.
That's why I know, because he was a member of the PSP, and he told the communists, "Okay, they're going to kill Jesus Menendez tomorrow."
And
because I gave the order.
Yeah.
They didn't do anything.
No.
They
didn't believe it. Didn't believe it was possible. And the only thing, and I'll probably finish on this note. the chap, and I've got his name somewhere, the chap who shot Jesus Menendez, who was a captain in the army, was charged with some breach of military discipline, but never really came to court or anything, and he was still just kind of vaguely under menace of this until when Batista's coup happened, and one of the first things that Batista did was the presidential pardon for him. However, in 1958, in December 1958, this chap was commanding a platoon in northern Las Villas province, and a sugar workers militia got him, put him up against the back of a wall and shot him. So what goes around comes around.